Welcome everybody on this, at least on Nantucket, it's a cold, wet February night. Thanks for joining us. I'm just going to say a couple of words by way of introduction about our author tonight, Russell Shorto, and then we'll be underway. It's going to be a conversation between the two of us. And as we go along, if you think of a question, put it in the chat. And then at the end of our conversation, we'll take questions and see how it goes. So Russell Shorot is a historian and author of 7 books, among them The Island at the Center of the World, Descartes' Bones, Amsterdam, Revolution Song, and this year's Small Time. He graduated from George Washington University and served as director of the John Adams Institute in Amsterdam for 5 years. And in 2009, he received a Dutch knighthood in the Order of Orange Nassau for strengthening the relationship between America and the Netherlands. He's currently a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine and is zooming into us tonight from Cumberland, Maryland. So in Small Time, A History of My Family and the Mob, which came out on February 2nd, Russ gives us his own story, a tale of Italian immigrants coming to America, a story of life in the factory town of Johnstown, Pennsylvania after the Second World War, and a portrait of his relationship with his father who helps with research. So, and I should say that this is the second time that Russ has come to see us at the Atheneum. He was here in 2015. To talk about his book, Amsterdam. And when I met you then, you said, I like origin stories. I write books about origin stories. So my question to you tonight is, what was it like to write the origin story of your own family?
That is very perceptive of you. Often when people say, well, okay, you've written about the American Revolution. My first book was called Gospel Truth. It was about the search for the historical Jesus. The Island at the Center of the World is about the Dutch founding of New York. What do those things have in common? And that's my answer, that I tend to try to go for origins. Living in New York, the Dutch founded New York, so that was the beginnings of that. Being raised Catholic, search for the historical Jesus was my attempt to get at those origins. And yes, this one is a much more personal origin story, which I never thought I would write, but I was sort of nudged into it. And once it was made, well, I'll just back up and tell you how I got into it. But first, let me just thank you, Amy, and thanks to the Nantucket Atheneum for inviting me. And it's nice to be back, although last time I was there in the summer in person, and that was more fun, frankly. Yeah. Although this is great too, and it is great that people can tune in from wherever they are. So what happened, as you would gather from the array of my book titles, everything I've done before this has been, for the most part, about long ago and far away. So doing the work of narrative history involved spending time in archives and libraries and roaming around old stones and buildings and old books. And I always knew that my grandfather, who I was named after, was kind of a mob leader in my hometown. But I think all families have things that they don't talk about, and yet as a kid you somehow absorb that information. So I knew that, and I also absorbed the idea that we don't talk about this. So I was a dutiful son, and I just kind of walled that off, and it was just this funny truth about our family. And then several years ago, I was at home over Christmas, and I should say that this is my father's father that we're talking about. And my mother's cousin happened to be home at the same time. And he was pushing 80. And he had a whole career early in life. First of all, he was a numbers runner for my grandfather. Then he had left town. He was a jazz musician, and he had his whole career in Las Vegas. And he had come home that same Christmas. And people said, oh, let's go see him down at this club where he was playing. And so we went down, and there was a break between the sets, and we're all standing around. And I should say that the other people I was with were relatives, most of them elderly, and these were all people who stayed in town. So they had kind of internalized that we don't talk about that vibe. But Frank, since he had left when he was young, to him, these were golden memories, you know? And so he looks across at me and he kind of does this and he says, Russell, you're the writer. What are we going to do about the story? And I said, what story? And he said, your grandfather, the mob. And all I could just feel everybody else kind of, you know, shrink because, you know, you don't talk about this. And I kind of did too. But he kind of burst that bubble. He made me realize that those guys are dead and gone. This is history. And, you know, I've become a big proponent of doing family history. And one of the aspects of it that is very important is when you're doing family history, you're doing history. You know, you're contributing to the great database of the past. So I realized, you know, this isn't going to be, I mean, it's going to vanish. You know, I knew these guys didn't keep notebooks. So maybe I could do something with it. But I was hesitant, partly because of, you know, I knew, I guess, that it was going to get very personal, but also because I knew that they didn't keep notebooks. So, you know, and I write nonfiction, and I'd write books that have footnotes, and, you know, I want to be able to pin things down. And I said that more or less to Frank, and he said, well, you know, if you get serious about this, there's more there than meets the eye, you know. So I was living in Europe at the time, and eventually I decided, it stayed in my head, and I said, all right, I'm going to go home for a week and see what I can turn up. And he said, all right, meet me at my hangout, which is Panera Bread. And I thought we were going to, you know, I turned on my recorder. I thought he was just going to tell me some stories or something. And soon a little old guy comes up, and another one and another one. He'd put out the word, and eventually there's like 8 guys around us, and they're like leaning on their canes and things. 4 hours later, I hit stop on the recorder, and I said, okay, there's something here. I mean, they had 4 hours worth of stories. And even that, though, I mean, that's stories of people remembering and putting this gloss on events from 50 or 60 or 70 years ago. That isn't very substantial. So my next step was to do the archival work. My dad at the time was friends with the chief of police, so he gave me my own key to their records room. I you know, did a Freedom of Information Act request with the FBI. So, you know, then eventually I had 2 layers of information. I had the wonderful, rich stories, not just from that first encounter, but I eventually ended up doing about 250 hours worth of interviews with people. And then I had this documentation to support it. And so together with those kind of 2 levels of information, I wrote this book.
That was going to be one of my questions, because it seems like when you're writing memoir, you have those barriers of, you know, the things we don't talk about as a family. So
Yeah.
you sort of have to clear those hurdles. But also, I just know from my own family, everybody remembers things differently, or they put emphasis on different things. And it's amazing to me, you know, what I remember doesn't necessarily line up with what my siblings remember, unless it was a really startling event. And so, so what was the challenge in sort of, you almost have to take a step back and say, these aren't my family members, and think of it as the storyteller and decide whose voice and what's important. And so talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that as I said, I have become really big on doing family history, and I have an online course, which I will plug here. It's called tellyourfamilystory.com. And I take you through the process, and I use my research on this book as a way to take you through that process. And it's certainly true that memory is imperfect and people remember things in very different ways. And the way to deal with that simply is to get a range of perspectives. And if you have other documentation to put with it, the act of going through that, you're not trying to create the absolute objective record of what happened. You will never do that. What you're trying to do is tell a story as best and as honestly as you can. So by getting a range of memories from people who remember it and seeing where they differ and adding these other elements to it, you come to your own perspective on it. And your own perspective might be one clear thing. You might decide these people are wrong, these people are right. Or it might be, it might include those different, those varying perspectives on what happened, a little bit of a Rashomon effect, where
Right.
you're looking at the same story from different angles. But
Well, and I also get the sense that the different people in your book had access to different levels of information.
yes.
too.
And in fact, the people in my family and in the town who I talked to, when I broached the subject, at first I was like, oh, they're gonna, react with, we're gonna say, don't go there. But for the most part, people wanted me to do it. And they wanted me to do it partly because, especially since this was something that people didn't really talk about, everybody had their own little window, their own little pieces of information or hearsay. But they were curious what I would come up with in trying to put it all together into one story. So there was a lot of it that they didn't know as well. And I think that goes, it doesn't have to be a mob story for that to be the case. Everybody has their own, often very narrow take on things.
So tell us a little bit about your grandfather, your relationship with him, your dad's relationship with him, what life was like growing up as a kid with this unspoken thing around you.
Yeah. Well, life to me was I just had a normal American childhood. I didn't, you kind of put that out of your head, and it was not his heyday was before I came on the scene. So, aside from the fact that in some corner of my brain, I was aware of that didn't affect things too much for me. But my grandfather, as I explored this, I obviously was exploring the history of the mob in America. And I was amazed at the extent to which my grandfather's life tracked the rise of the mob and how it came into being. His parents, so my great-grandparents, emigrated from Sicily around the turn of the 20th century, along with about 4 million other Southern Italians. And they, for the most part, they came to work either on plantations or in coal mines. So really hard work that nobody else wanted to do. One of the funny things, or strange things, about this immigration of Southern Italians is that it coincided with the end of the Civil War. That's when it began. So slavery is at an end, and you have all these plantations that need to find workers. So they were the ones who first started advertising in Naples and Messina and these places. So they came, and they came legally. They came to do work that other people didn't want to do. They were willing to do it. And they were, treated brutally. They had to live in company towns, and life was very restrictive. But they pretty much, that generation pretty much hoed the line. They stayed in their assigned places. They had children. My grandfather grew up then as the next generation. So he grows up, he goes to American schools, and he's learning about how great America is. And America is, building the 20th century. And you have all of these heroes who were, in many cases, they were the political figures like George Washington, but they were also people like Henry Ford and Frick and Astor and Carnegie and Mellon, and these people who built or were building the country, who basically did what they wanted. That's how they got so big. They bent governments to their will. They bribed politicians, and people were taught to admire them. So my grandfather grows up still being very much discriminated against. In that era, Southern Italians were, I mean, there was no way you were going to become, you were going to go to college or become even something like a bank manager or a department store manager. So your options were very limited. Then along comes Prohibition, which is this, in a way, a golden opportunity, because here is this industry, this product that everybody wants, and yet the businesses that had come into being to feed that desire are now illegal. So that's what happened around the country in towns large and small, and it was often
Sorry.
And it was often single mothers who were asked by Italian gentlemen in their neighborhoods to put stills in their house to create moonshine. And my grandfather's father had died, so his mother had 9 children and needed to get by. And so this kind of pre-mafia figure, an Italian man in the neighborhood, tells her, you make this stuff and have your kid go out and sell it, and you'll get a piece of the results. And so that's how he got his first jobs. He was barely a teenager, and he was on the streets selling stuff in as my dad remembered, filled in with Coke bottles filled with it. And that was happening all over the country. So then, march ahead a few years, Prohibition ends. By now, he's in his late teens. And as happened all over the country, he had by this time shifted to another revenue stream, which was gambling. Gambling was, I mean, it's hard to imagine how frowned upon this was. There was this very moralistic Christian, that's a terrible thing. We don't gamble. And yet everybody wanted to gamble. So here was another product. And that's what he did, and that's what they did. And it was really in that transition, I think, from booze to gambling that the mafia came into being.
And, my only awareness about the mafia is what I see in television and movies, and that's always in big cities. So how is the mob different in a smaller city like Johnstown or in these smaller places that you researched?
That's kind of the backdrop of the book. It's a story, if you look at what's in front and center, it's a story of my grandfather and my search for him. So it's a very personal, very small story, but it's really the story of the small town mob in America, which, as you say, most people, their image of the mafia, the American mafia, is of New York and Chicago, and starting back with, gunning people down with machine guns and all that kind of thing. It was in every town of any size, from Schenectady to Dubuque to Amarillo, Texas, to Fresno, California. And for the most part, in smaller towns, it was not terribly violent. It was built around gambling. And it couldn't be violent because if it had become so, in a small town couldn't withstand that. Public outcry, I think, would force the authorities to really crack down. So as long as they kept things relatively tidy, everything was in the open. And everybody I interviewed over a certain age, they all knew who my grandfather was. They knew who his team, who they all were. They knew where they operated out of. It was a place called City Cigar, which was a cigar store in front, and behind that was a pool hall. And upstairs they had their offices, and from their offices they ran their operations. They had the center of their operation was a numbers game, which half the town played. They had people estimated there were about 100 people they had in their employ just on this numbers game, most of whom were runners who would go all through all the different neighborhoods and to the bars and cafes and diners and all that. Because everybody, the other, I think, interesting thing about the mob in general, especially in small towns, is that it was entertainment. And this is mostly, it was in its heyday before television really was a force. And in my case, in Johnstown, it was from the end of World War II to 1960. So essentially the 50s. And in 1950, 5% of American households had a TV. By 1960, 90% did. And that tracks the trajectory of the mob and its rise. In the early 50s, it was really booming, and it was in all these kind of places, running all these kinds of pastimes, really. Because people, what were you going to do in the evening? You went out to cafes or bars and you hung out and you shot pool and you played a little of this game and you played a little of that game. Maybe you shot pool and they gambled on pool, or maybe you did what they had what they called tip seals, which was like a lottery ticket. It was a board with these numbers on it, and you pulled it, you bought a number, you pulled it off, and if the number underneath matched your number, you won $1 or $5 or whatever it was.
Huh. So you're saying that television killed the mafia?
That's one way of looking at it. That was something that I don't think I've seen. I talked to a number of historians of the mob, and nobody quite made that correlation to me, but it's something that I noted in the course of my research. Another thing that they had that they were very big on was pinball machines. And it was very lucrative because they used pinball for gambling as well. In the late 40s, the big innovation with pinball was flippers, on the side. So you have flippers. And as soon as they had that, it gave the player a feeling of control. Like you can, control how this game went. So it's not just a game of chance. And that then made it lucrative, because the way it worked for gambling was in my town, and I'm sure it was the case all over, it was the pinball machines were in hotel lobbies and in diners and just any kind of place that would have, the public. So you would win a certain number of free games if you were playing well. At a certain point, then you would go up to the bartender and you'd say, okay, I've got 10 free games. And by agreed upon reckoning, the bartender would pay out a certain amount of cash for those free games. And then he would just go and reset the machine. And the beauty of it, as far as the mob was concerned, was you didn't have, there's no product. There weren't like Kewpie dolls or packs of chewing gum or something that the IRS would say, well, where's the money? You have to pay the tax on this. It just vanished.
Right.
So it was like easy gambling.
It makes me think of the pachinko parlors in Japan.
Yes, yes.
Kind of a similarity between the two.
Exactly. That's right. And they have their mob, of course, too.
Right. Yeah. It's so funny. I don't associate games with the mob, but I can see that, they're just, pinball machines are everywhere and easy to drop a few coins and play and see how you do. Games and
so they had a variety of gambling devices, but also then over time they spread into legitimate businesses too. And one way they would do that would be, for example, they would have pinball machines in a bar, and so they're splitting that take on those machines with the bar owner. But maybe the bar owner is behind on his rent, or maybe he needs money for his kids to go to college or something. So then they would say, all right, well, let's, we'll loan you some money. And then if you can't pay back, they say, all right, we'll take a piece of your business in exchange. Right. So they had their fingers in different pies all around town. So it was a complex operation. Yeah,
it sounds like it. And for your book, you traveled to Italy and spent some time where your ancestors came from, basically. Had you been to that area before, or was that the
I
first
had been
time?
to Italy many times. I'd never been to Sicily, and was again, back on the notion of researching your family history, not just my family history. It's a wonderful, rewarding thing to do, to go to where your people came from. I had done some legwork beforehand and made arrangements with a man who is the town historian of the town is called San Pier-Niceto. It's in the way up in the hills above Messina, the port. And so I brought my family, and he arranged to meet us. And they're of course wonderfully open and warm and welcoming, and so he paraded us through the streets. Italians have what they call passeggiata, which is in the evening after dinner, especially in warm weather, people just kind of take a walk through the neighborhood. And so we did the passeggiata together, and everybody else was out on the town, and he would tell them who we were and what we were doing. And so my last name is Shorto. It was originally Shorto, Sciotto. And we probably met half a dozen people in town with the same name, and we're trying to figure out, oh, we're probably,
Right.
probably related somehow, So, I think, and I'm not unique in that kind of experience. I think people who go back and look for their origins, it's remarkable. I mean, depending on how far back you have to go. In this case, it was still within living memory. There were people there old enough to remember people who he had left behind, and so on. So, it helps you, it's all about making connections, right?
Right.
That's
Did
what we're
you,
all trying to do all the time.
right? And so in all of your prodigious research, did you have any surprises? Any, stumble across anything that you absolutely did not see coming?
Sure. The book, right now we're talking at the level of kind of social history and things like that, but the book gets very personal about my family, and I enlisted in the course of writing it my father to help me. My father lived his whole life in our hometown in Johnstown, and to his credit, he immediately was willing to do it. And I say to his credit because I think he knew that what was going to be difficult, because he had a very difficult relationship with his father, with Russ, my grandfather.
Who you're named after.
Who I was named after. So much so that for much of my life, they didn't speak. They lived in the same town, but they didn't speak. And that's why I barely knew my grandfather. And so slowly, as we were working our way, well, what we would do, I moved to be close to town. So I was an hour away, and I'd come to town, I'd sit with my parents in their living room, and I'd start asking them questions, and one thing would lead to another. And by the way, in my course, I have a whole class on how to interview people about the past, which is a fun subject in itself. And some name would come up, and I'd say, oh, I never heard of that guy. Is he still around? And my dad would, look him up in his phone and call him and say, are you around? We're coming over. And so we'd go over and, we'd go to that guy's house. We'd hang out in his front yard for an hour or whatever. And there would be another whole window onto, his perspective on what people were up to. So my father, slowly by doing this, we were getting closer and closer to this enigma, because my father, who was helping me with this, was a wonderfully open person. And he had this mantra, you're only as sick as your secrets, which I think he got from AA meetings. His father was the opposite. His father was incredibly closed. Everybody I talked to, I started to get sick of hearing it. Everybody, I would say, what was Russ like? And they'd say he was very quiet. He never, revealed himself. My dad once said to me that his father never broke character. I mean, which is a strange thing to say about your father. Like he was always playing, putting up a facade, right, playing a role. So we had this. That's pretty difficult when you're trying to find someone in the past, and it turns out that there's someone who doesn't want to be found. but as we got closer, it got more complicated and I think more difficult for my dad in particular. And you asked if there are any things that were really surprising. I grew up with this notion that my grandfather wanted his son, my father, into the business. He wanted to groom him for a role in the business, but my dad, as a young man who was starting a family, said no. So to me, growing up, I had this idealized notion in the back of my mind that he did this for us. You know, he defied this, and my grandfather always seemed like this dark, scary person. And my dad was very open and light, and so he did this for us. So as I'm sitting, a lot of the time I'm sitting with, you know, an old mobster or another, just one-on-one. My dad wasn't there. And this one guy, I'm telling this story to, and he's like looking at me and he said, you know, Russell, I'm sorry, it wasn't like that. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, your dad wanted to be in the business in the worst way. And, you know, this totally, I didn't let on, but I was stunned. And it took me a long while, but eventually then I confronted my dad. And in fact, it was the opposite. It was exactly the opposite. He wanted in, and his father, I guess, out of some sense of trying to protect him, wouldn't let him, and in fact was violent toward him when he showed up at the pool hall that was their operation, and would really beat him up. And that was his way of, I guess, protecting him. And it, you know, it then became this, I think, kind of classic male story, generational story, where they don't articulate, and as a result, you know, their whole lives, that, you know, they have this like non-existent relationship. They both retreated to their own corners, and so yeah, that was to me a big surprise, kind of a revelation.
And do you feel like the process of helping you research the book helped your dad get some clarity on the relationship?
I hope so. You know, it's funny when you do this kind of work, you're talking about very intimate things, you know, but you're talking about it from a distance, you know, because that's safer, you know. So since we're being kind of like scientists exploring this topic, we can discuss and we can look at it, we can talk to other people, but it's not so easy to go from that to that other level, you know. Right. So, and again, I would say that in talking to, working with students who were working on their own family history projects, I encountered the same kind of thing too. And that's probably okay. I mean, it doesn't mean like you have to be doing psychotherapy while right. while you're doing this. They can be two different things.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think it can serve a purpose for you too, you know.
Yeah, and I just know, you know, both my parents are now 89, and there's also a generational thing. You know, they're of a time where you don't get all, you know, touchy-feely. You don't talk about your feelings. I think we finally trained my mother to tell us that she loves us, but it took, you know, until she was 80 to do it. You know, it's just a different way of looking at the world. And so talking about these things is not as easy, I don't think.
And not just generational, but whatever is the mode that you grew up with your parents, the way the terms on which your relationship is set, it's not going to change like that, you know. So you're still going to both be who you are. You're not suddenly going to fall over each other weeping or something, unless that's your relationship, I guess.
Yeah.
What's your background, by the way? Yeah, ethnic.
Well, very waspy. I would say Dutch, English.
Okay, so yeah, all right. So
and some French.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, but very New England, like New England Yankee. We are independent. We are staunch. We don't talk about our feelings. We're very proud of that heritage.
Right.
So yeah, so always interesting. But I find that at this point in their lives, they really want to talk about the past. It's a source of comfort for them. And they want to make sure that we know the stories and that we understand who was who and what they did.
Again, that's what is such a rewarding thing about doing family history, because when you sit down with people, the generation or two who are people who are in their 70s or 80s or 90s, they often want to, that's where they are, and that's what they want to talk about. So you're meeting them where, I mean, and I spent a lot of time with people in nursing homes who couldn't remember who was president, but who, were very fluent in talking about, Main Street in Johnstown in the 1940s,
Right. Yeah.
So why not, you're serving both of your needs there.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm curious about the mob. Is it still a presence in Johnstown, or is it pretty much faded away?
No, it faded away long ago. When I was actually in Sicily, in my ancestral village, I asked them about it because, of course, that's the origin of the mafia in Sicily. And it's always been a very poor town. They said, look around, there's no money here. Why would they be here? And that's certainly the case. And, I'm not really a scholar of the mob, but I have spent time with a lot of scholars of the mob lately. And I think that clearly that form of organized crime has tremendously diminished. I think it was very much a product of what I started talking about at the beginning. Immigration, I didn't even go into, but you had this whole wave of immigration, especially from southern Italy, also from places like Ireland and Poland, and it was overwhelmingly Catholic. And then you had the return of the Ku Klux Klan as a reaction to that. The Klan originally came into being after the Civil War as an anti-Black outfit. Then it died. Then it came back because this new Catholic inundation was a threat to American values, people thought. So that's a whole other kind of wash on the story.
Yeah, fascinating. And it also sounds like, I'm just maybe jumping to some conclusions here, but in the beginning you said that there were so few opportunities that the mafia was a path, but maybe as Italian Americans assimilated more and they had more opportunities and less of a need to be in the mafia. Is that a fair statement?
I think that was the, I would love to, be able to ask him if I'm right, but I think that was why my grandfather blocked his son from trying to be involved, because when he got in, there was really, I mean, if you were smart, he was young and smart and ambitious, what could he do? That was the path that was open to him. By the time my dad is in, like in the early 50s, when he's in that position, he didn't need to be that way. Italians weren't stigmatized in the same way. He had a lot of opportunities.
And so what did your dad end up doing?
My dad ended up, when I was telling you that they ran operations, they had pieces of businesses all over town. They had this, my dad did the same thing, but in a legit way. He was all over town. He had bars and real estate, and he had all different kinds of. So he was. I now see, through the process of working on this book, I see that he was trying to. He was trying to make his father respect him and be proud of him, basically. Right. But doing it in a legitimate way rather than in the old way.
And so, are you the first generation of your family that went to college and lived someplace else and led a very different life? And
yes.
What's that like for you, when you go back to Johnstown and hang out with your family?
Well, it's, I think that this book, Small Time, is really, to me, just a variant of the American immigrant story. And in what it ended up being is the great-grandparents, the people who came, that generation, and then the grandparents, who in this case reacted to discrimination, as did so many others, by creating this path for themselves. Then the next generation, which was my parents, who didn't have to do that, and were part of the fabric of the town in its when it was very vibrant. And then I'm this other generation who is able now and has the luxury to look back and try to piece that story together, you know. And you know, it's, you think of the mob as one thing, but it's a manifestation of the American immigrant experience. And you know, again, going back to students I've had, so many of them have done that in different ways, you know, with different kinds of family stories, whether it's Central American or, you know, wherever their people are from. There are similarities. There are remarkable overlaps and similarities.
Right.
The first generation that comes, whether it was in the 1980s or in the 1880s, you know, they kind of go through similar things.
Right. Cool. Well, I love the idea of it's both a macrocosm and a microcosm. You know, it's a story that works on many levels.
Excuse me. Yeah, that's what I
All right.
I think it drinks a little too much water. I try to do in all my books. I write narrative history, and to me, that's basically just storytelling about the past. And you have a central story, which is always a small story that is typically two people in conflict in a particular time and place. And then as you pull back, you have to sketch, you have to understand the background. Why are they here? What are they fighting over? What are the larger forces? And it takes on a different character when it's your own family, but it's the same process.
Over the course of all your books, you've sort of lived and written in a lot of different time periods in world history. I mean, the Dutch, when they kind of ruled the waters and ruled the world, and the beginnings of New York City. Do you have a period of history that you really love being in, doing work in?
I think I can really lose myself in whatever period I happen to be working in, but maybe that's because I am drawn to that to begin with. But I guess I've spent the most time in the 1600s in my work. And my next book is going to be kind of a sequel to The Island at the Center of the World. So it will be about the Dutch and the English in the 1600s. So I'll be back there again. And yeah, that's because it's right at the beginning of the modern. And in so many ways, it's like, they're like half medieval and half modern. And it's such an interesting, you know, right when you think, oh, that person is just like us, and then they do something, you go, no, I don't get that.
I think that's one of my favorite things about reading history or researching it is, you know, in my mind, I think of people from long ago being or their lives being so different than mine. But it seems like there's more similarities than differences. Yes, the technology is different. You know, what they wore and how they got around is different. But it seems like, you know, I was surprised. There's a book from the 1780s, I think, called Letters to an American Farmer. And there's I think there's 5 chapters in there that cover Nantucket. And I was fascinated reading that because in my mind, I was thinking, you know, people in the 1700s lived where they were born and didn't move around a lot. And it turns out people have been moving all over the world since the beginning of time. You know, people just have been on the move for the whole time.
Yeah, it's what I tell students is the smaller a story is, the bigger it is. The more you zero in on, you know, in my case, I guess my grandparents are at the center of this story. The more you zero in, like, why would people care to read about these two people who lived in, you know, the 20th century in my little hometown? Because if you get really in tight on a couple, it's love, it's betrayal, it's universal. It's what we all experience, you know, and that's what you're talking about. Somebody living in the 1780s or the 1680s. There are certain recurring themes.
Yeah, human themes.
Yeah.
So it's 7:48. We have about 10 minutes left or 12 minutes or so. Let's take a look in the chat and the Q&A. This would be a great time to put your questions either in the chat or the Q&A, which you'll see icons for those at the bottom of your screen. Let's see. So Julie has a question with stills. I think she's talking about making alcohol stills. With stills being in homes full of children, did you hear of any escapades that happened, humorous or not?
I think, and I didn't hear escapades like the kids getting into it. It was mostly, this was our, this was how we're going to get by. This was how we're going to get through the week. We have to earn this much this week in order to, and the stories I heard along with that were, stopping the Coke bottles and going out and selling them. And otherwise, there was a train track nearby, and the train would deliver coal into the steel mill, and some of it would fly off the top. So they'd send the kids out to pick up lumps of coal to heat the house. So it was more like, survival stories.
And everybody working towards the same goal too, it sounds like.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Let's see. So John wants to know if you went to Catholic school.
No, I didn't.
That came up.
No, I went to Catholic school through third grade.
Okay. All right. That's it for questions. What else should we talk about?
Well, I think that the going back to the notion of, when I was working on this, it occurred to me, what happened was I was working on this book, and I was asked to be a writer in residence at Baruch College in New York City. And so I made the writing workshop doing family history. And it got a lot of, there were a lot of people who wanted to be part of the course. It was a very popular course. And and that in turn got me interested in thinking about, well, I should maybe do something further with this. And if you're doing a workshop on family history at a place like Baruch, you're in the middle of New York City, and these are, for the most part, working class families living in New York who are from everywhere. And so the first couple of classes, I said, all right, what I want you to do is each come up with 3 stories in your family, because I didn't want them to just write the whole history of their family. So I wanted to, that the smaller a story it is, the bigger it is, come up with 3 stories. And I think we had 16 students. So that's, 60, that's like 50 stories from all over the world. And it was just such an amazing rush of different stories. And yet there were these common themes. And one of the most common themes was what I just, when you asked me what was my biggest surprise, I had this total, I had it the wrong way. I thought about this, what happened one way, and in fact, the truth was something else. A common theme was someone grew up with this story and they wanted to investigate it. Once they investigate, they realized it was much more complicated than that. And I think that's because those stories, our family, our past, that was packaged for us as children. And once you, as an adult, decide, no, I'm going to really investigate this, you realize, okay, that was a children's story, and now I'm growing up. Right. So it's an act of growing up, I think.
Yeah. Okay, so the audience is waking up. We have lots of questions. Let's see. So Leslie says, can Russell tell the story about the busts and the people who were sacrificed?
The busts and the people.
I'm assuming she means the mob in Johnstown and maybe members of your family.
I thought you meant this.
Arrests. Oh, yeah, not like statues, but arrests.
I see. I think I know what she means. Well, this is, again, very common with the way they worked all over the country. They paid off all the authorities. And they, in exchange, they were allowed to have this kind of gambling franchise in town. But periodically, I think around once a month, in order to look good, for the authorities to look good, they would have to make an arrest. So there was several different operations. One I told you about was called City Cigar, and that was kind of where the elite guys hang. It was two doors from City Hall. That was, the mayor would come, the people who worked in City Hall would come and shoot pool and gamble and get their payoff or whatever. But there were other, like, more working class places. And what they would do is they would call and say, okay, we're coming at 5 o'clock. So they would know, all right, everybody get out. And they would have one guy take the fall. And that guy, they would leave that guy. It was usually an old guy who didn't have anything to lose, didn't have to worry about his record or anything. And he would be left there with, they would give him sort of a token number of gambling tickets. So there would be something that they would find. So it could be written up in the paper the next day. And that was just the standard way of kind of saving face for everyone. And it went on year after year like that.
Fascinating. It's like an orchestrated dance.
A dance. Yeah, very much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So see, Monica says, do you think your grandfather helped your father behind the scenes to help make his businesses successful?
I don't know that my grandfather did. We haven't talked about my grandfather's brother-in-law. The mob kind of operated, I found the corporation model very useful, and I think they did. They emulated American corporations, including opening branch offices. So as they were expanding, that's what they did. And what happened was there was a mob figure from Philadelphia who was assigned Johnstown and told to open the franchise there. And so he went to Johnstown and he met my grandfather's sister. And my grandfather had risen as a gambler, and we haven't talked about him as a cheat, but he was a card sharp and he could cheat at dice. And so he knew the town at that level. So here comes his sister's boyfriend, who becomes her husband. They hook up these two guys and they open this franchise together. So that guy, my grandfather's brother-in-law, who was called Little Joe, he was really the one who brought the franchise. So he was the head of the operation. My grandfather was his number two. And Little Joe, my dad's uncle, my dad told me when he bought our house where we lived when I was in high school, it was Little Joe that he got the down payment from. So yes, he did help.
Okay, nice. Let's see. Here's a question I find I don't understand, but maybe you will. Are you still on the bicycle committee? Does that make sense to you?
Bicycle committee.
I'm not sure what that means.
Maybe they're referring to Amsterdam. I lived in Amsterdam for a long time, and I don't think I was ever on a bicycle committee there, but I'll bet the question's related to that. Okay.
Yes, I do. I've been to Amsterdam a couple times, and they're serious bicyclers.
Yeah.
Let's see. Do you think your grandfather retired, in quotes, and how does that look if you're in the mob?
I tell the story of this in the book. My grandfather, aside from being a small town mobster, was progressively a greater and greater drunk, and like a real serious binge drinker, and a really terrible womanizer. And it's really what I say in the book is I think my family could have lived with him being a mob figure. It was those things that really caused the scars. And eventually his drinking got to the point where he just had to tell his brother-in-law that, or else. I've heard two stories. One is that his brother-in-law fired him, and the other is that Russ said to Little Joe, I'm no good to you.
Right. It almost sounds like Little Joe was sort of the patriarchal figure in your family.
I think he held that together, yeah.
Let's see. Ken, who asked the bicycle question, says, yes, Amsterdam, we talked about it. So let's see. And then someone wants to know, when you're in New York, where do you get Italian food? What restaurants do you go to for Italian food?
Off the top of my head, I can't answer that. There are a lot of great Italian restaurants. I'm not an expert in that.
I'll bet the food in Sicily was great.
It was wonderful and quite different from the rest of Italy.
And probably different from what we think of as Italian.
Spicy, not just spicy, but Mediterranean, almost Middle Eastern influences.
Let's see. Well, let's see. Someone asked a question about violence. I think you talked about this at the beginning, that there wasn't a lot of violence, but the question is, was there violence like in Providence, Rhode Island?
There was, I mean, the violence came with, you were talking about, I mean, in general, relative to big cities, there wasn't violence, but there was a murder right in the middle of the story, which is kind of what the book revolves around. And I think that murder is what spells the beginning of the end for the operation in Johnstown. There was, I interviewed a guy in his nursing home bed who was like an enforcer for them, who would go and, he said, I just, they would, somebody would welch on a bet and they wouldn't pay their money, and they'd send me off, and I'd just take a pistol and I'd stick it in his face and I'd smack him around. And, so there was a lot of that kind of activity. And,
right.
But the real violence, I think, came from friction between, because everybody had territories. There was Johnstown, nearby you had Altoona and Greensburg, these, industrial cities in southwestern Pennsylvania. And the real tension and violence came in friction between those groups.
And so here we have a movie question. So it's going to be two parts. One is my question and one is the person in the chat. But I was very impressed that you got extensive blurb from Francis Ford Coppola. So I was curious how that came about. And then John in the chat asks, do you have an opinion about the movie The Godfather?
About The Godfather, I guess I ought to be ashamed to say that I always avoided throughout my life mafia literature and movies and things like that, but I know why. I know it was because I knew this, I had this connection to it. So I always avoided it until suddenly then I wanted nothing but that. It was 24 hours a day, this kind of stuff. So yeah, I mean, my opinion about The Godfather, aside from, great movie, is I think people who know tell me that it is very heavily fictionalized and this mythic component to it. But I will tell you that people in my town, there's the famous wedding scene in The Godfather. Little Joe's daughter got married at this big swanky club that they owned out in the woods. And people told me there were like, hundreds of cars, people came from all over. And it was the fanciest thing they'd ever seen. No one ever seen this. And then a couple of years later, The Godfather came out, and everybody was like, "Oh!" Suddenly, the penny dropped.
Yeah.
But the Francis Ford Coppola. I would like to say, oh, he and I are great friends, but no. My editor thought, you try to get blurbs, you try to get people to endorse the book, and she said, wouldn't it be great if we could get him? And I said, yeah. And she got an email address, I guess, for his assistant, and wrote, and the assistant said, yeah, he'll take a look. So it was as simple as that. And he wrote a very lengthy, it was longer even than what's on the book. And what I liked about it is he's really pointing out, you can kind of see a director reading the book. He picks out things like the tip seals and the pinball and the places called Melody Lounge and, things that just jumped out at him. So that was nice.
Yeah, great. Very cool. Well, it's 8:02. So I sort of feel like we should wrap up. And I just like to thank you for coming to see us. And we will get you back physically on the island as soon as it's safe to do so. And any final words for us this evening?
I just want to thank you, Amy, and thank the Nantucket Atheneum, and thank everybody who's been tuning in. This isn't, I long for the, face-to-face contact, but this is the next best thing.
All right, great. All right, well, thanks everybody, and have a great evening.